The morning of my wedding, I stood in front of my grandmother's antique mirror adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to 4 generations of women in my family. My reflection looked back at me, radiant in ivory silk, completely unaware that in 12 hours I would be making the most calculated decision of my life. I'm Rachel Morrison, and what happened at my reception that night would either destroy my marriage or forge it into something unbreakable. If you've ever had to make a split-second choice that would define your entire future, drop a comment below and tell me what you decided. I read every single one, and your stories might just save someone else from making the wrong call. Most brides spend their wedding day worried about whether the flowers match the tablecloths, or if Uncle Frank will behave himself during the speeches. I spent mine conducting surveillance on my new mother-in-law like she was a hostile foreign agent, because after 18 months of engagement, I had learned that Victoria Blackwell didn't just dislike me. She despised my very existence with the focused intensity of a laser beam. You see, the Blackwells are what polite society calls established wealth. What that really means is their money has been sitting in trust funds for so long it's developed its own ecosystem. Victoria had spent 63 years perfecting the art of looking down on people, and when her son Daniel brought home a kindergarten teacher from the wrong side of the tracks, she saw me as nothing more than a parasite trying to infiltrate her bloodline. Our first meeting should have been a warning. Daniel had invited me to Sunday dinner at the family estate, a sprawling Georgian mansion that probably cost more than my entire neighborhood. I wore my best dress, a navy blue sheath that I had saved 3 months to buy. Victoria greeted me at the door wearing a smile that never reached her eyes, and a Chanel suit that cost more than my annual salary. She looked me up and down like I was a specimen under a microscope. Then she asked if I had brought my resume, because she wanted to make sure I understood what kind of family I was trying to marry into. When Daniel introduced me as his girlfriend, she corrected him. She said I was his friend who happened to be a girl, and wasn't that sweet. The insults were never direct. Victoria was too sophisticated for that. Instead, she deployed what I came to think of as strategic condescension. She would forget my name and call me Rochelle or Rebecca. She would ask if I needed help reading the wine menu because the words were so complicated. She would tell stories about Daniel's ex-girlfriend, a senator's daughter who spoke 4 languages and had gone to finishing school in Switzerland. But the real declaration of war came 6 months before the wedding. I was sitting in her pristine white living room, trying not to spill tea on the silk upholstery, when she slid an envelope across the coffee table. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a letter explaining that she was willing to pay me to disappear from her son's life. She told me it was a generous offer for someone of my background. She said I could use the money to go back to school, maybe become something more substantial than a teacher. She said Daniel deserved a wife who could match his social standing, and I was simply holding him back from his true potential. I looked at that check for a long time. $50,000 was more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was enough to pay off my student loans, buy a car that didn't break down every other month, maybe even put a down payment on a small house. For about 30 seconds, I actually considered taking it. Then I looked at Victoria, sitting there with her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, so confident that every person in the world had a price. I folded the check in half, then in half again, then tore it into tiny pieces and let them flutter onto her pristine white carpet like confetti. I told her that if she thought $50,000 was enough to buy me, she was insulting both my intelligence and my character. I said Daniel was lucky to have someone who loved him for who he was, not what his last name could do for her social calendar. Then I walked out, leaving those torn pieces of paper scattered across her floor like a declaration of independence. That was the moment Victoria stopped seeing me as a nuisance and started viewing me as a genuine threat. The bribes had failed, the intimidation had backfired, and the wedding was rapidly approaching. In her mind, I had forced her to escalate to more drastic measures. The week before the ceremony, strange things started happening. The florist called to confirm that we had canceled our order because of a death in the family. Our photographer received an anonymous tip that the wedding was off because the bride had been caught cheating. The caterer was told that we had decided to elope instead and wouldn't be needing their services. Each time I managed to straighten things out, but the pattern was obvious. Victoria was trying to sabotage our wedding through death by 1,000 cuts. She wanted to create so much chaos and stress that Daniel would finally see me as the problem and call everything off. When that didn't work, she moved to more personal attacks. I found my wedding dress hanging in the bridal suite with a mysterious stain across the bodice that looked suspiciously like red wine. My makeup artist canceled the morning of the wedding, claiming she had received a call from someone saying the bride had decided to do her own makeup instead. But it was the veil that really showed me how far Victoria was willing to go. It was an antique piece that had belonged to Daniel's great-grandmother, a delicate creation of French lace that was supposedly priceless. Victoria had insisted I wear it as something borrowed, and I had been honored by the gesture. 2 days before the wedding, I found it in my hotel room with a jagged tear right through the center. Victoria claimed it had caught on her bracelet when she was examining it, but I knew fabric well enough to recognize intentional damage. Someone had taken a knife or scissors to that lace and tried to destroy a family heirloom just to hurt me. I spent 8 hours that night carefully repairing the damage with silk thread and a magnifying glass. I didn't tell Daniel because I knew Victoria would spin it as me being careless with his family's treasures. She was counting on the fact that her behavior was so outrageous that no reasonable person would believe it. By the morning of the wedding, I was operating under the assumption that Victoria would try something dramatic during the reception. I just didn't know what form it would take. Would she stand up during the speeches and object to the marriage? Would she create some kind of medical emergency to steal focus from our special day? Would she try to start a fight with my parents? I never imagined she would resort to actually poisoning me. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Daniel looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, and when he saw me walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears of pure joy. Victoria sat in the front row wearing a silver gown that probably cost more than most people's cars, smiling that practiced smile she had perfected over decades of social events. During the vows, I caught her checking her watch twice. During the ring exchange, she was fidgeting with her purse. She looked like someone waiting for a show to start, and I realized with growing dread that the main event wasn't the ceremony. It was whatever she had planned for the reception. The cocktail hour passed in a blur of congratulations and small talk. I kept one eye on Victoria the entire time, watching as she worked the room like the social butterfly she had always been. She charmed my father with stories about Daniel's childhood. She complimented my mother's dress and asked where she had bought it. She played the role of the gracious mother-in-law perfectly, all while I knew she was planning something devastating. It wasn't until we moved into the main dining room for dinner that I saw my opportunity. I had excused myself to touch up my lipstick in the small powder room near the kitchen. When I came out, I saw Victoria standing at the bar, looking around to make sure no one was watching. That's when I noticed the small glass vial in her hand, no bigger than a perfume sample. She was holding it over my champagne flute, the one with our initials engraved on the side that the caterer had specially prepared for the bride and groom's toast. I watched in frozen horror as she tilted that vial and let 3 clear drops fall into my drink. Then she calmly tucked the empty container back into her beaded clutch and walked away as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain was trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mother-in-law, the woman who had given birth to the man I loved more than life itself, had just attempted to drug me at my own wedding reception. The rational part of my mind kicked in immediately. I had maybe 30 seconds before Victoria returned to the dining area, and I needed to make a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could confront her directly, create a scene in front of 200 guests, and risk being labeled as the hysterical bride who ruined her own wedding. I could dump out the champagne and pretend nothing happened, letting her get away with attempted assault, or I could turn her own weapon against her. I walked calmly to the bar, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor with mechanical precision. The bartender was busy preparing drinks for another table, his back turned to me. I reached for Victoria's champagne flute, the one she had been drinking from during cocktail hour, and I switched it with mine. Her poison was now in her glass. My untainted champagne was in mine. I picked up both flutes and walked back toward our table, feeling like I was carrying live grenades. The thing about decisive moments is that they reveal who you really are underneath all the social conditioning and polite pretenses. Most people would have panicked, would have screamed, would have made an emotional decision based on shock and fear. But I teach kindergarten for a living. I deal with tiny humans who lie, manipulate, and test boundaries every single day. I know how to stay calm when someone is trying to hurt me. Victoria was already seated when I returned, chatting animatedly with Daniel's aunt about her recent trip to the French Riviera. She looked up when I approached, and for just a split second, I saw something predatory flash across her face. She thought she had won. She thought I was walking toward my own destruction, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I set her champagne flute down in front of her with a gentle clink against the table. She didn't even glance at it. Why would she? In her mind, the trap had already been set. Daniel stood up to begin his speech, and the entire room fell silent. He looked so happy, so completely in love, talking about how I had changed his life for the better. He spoke about finding his soulmate, about building a future together, about the kind of love that makes you want to be a better person. Victoria sat there smiling and nodding, playing the role of the proud mother while internally counting down the minutes until I would start feeling the effects of whatever she had put in that glass. She had probably calculated exactly how long it would take for the substance to hit my system. She was expecting me to become dizzy, nauseous, maybe even collapse right there at the head table. I imagine she had a whole speech prepared about how the stress of the wedding had been too much for me, how I had been drinking too much, how this was proof that I wasn't stable enough to be part of the Blackwell family. She would play the concerned mother-in-law, rushing to my aid while secretly savoring every moment of my humiliation. But as Daniel finished his speech and raised his glass for the toast, it was Victoria who reached for her champagne first. She was so confident, so absolutely certain that she had orchestrated the perfect crime, that she didn't hesitate for even a second. The entire room raised their glasses in unison. 200 people celebrating our love and our future together. Victoria took a large sip of her champagne, her eyes locked on mine over the rim of the glass, waiting for me to drink my dose of destruction. I raised my glass to my lips and pretended to take a sip, barely letting the liquid touch my tongue. Victoria drained nearly half of her glass in one go, probably thinking she was toasting to my imminent downfall. Then we sat down, and I waited. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 minutes later. Victoria stopped mid-sentence while talking to my mother about the flower arrangements. Her hand went to her throat, and she blinked rapidly several times as if trying to clear her vision. I watched her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. Whatever she had put in that vial was fast-acting and powerful. Her pupils started to dilate, and a thin sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead despite the air conditioning. She tried to excuse herself from the table, probably planning to go to the bathroom and figure out what was happening to her, but her coordination was already compromised. When she stood up, she swayed slightly and had to grab the back of her chair for support. That's when the real show began. Victoria's face turned an alarming shade of gray, and she made a small choking sound that caught Daniel's attention. He immediately went into doctor mode, asking if she was okay, trying to take her pulse. She looked at him with confused, unfocused eyes and tried to speak, but only managed to slur something incomprehensible. Then her body decided it needed to expel whatever poison she had consumed. She doubled over and vomited spectacularly all over the white linen tablecloth, the expensive centerpiece, and her own silver designer gown. The sound was horrific. The smell was worse. 200 of the city's most elite social figures watched in stunned silence as Victoria Blackwell, the woman who had spent decades cultivating an image of perfect refinement, retched uncontrollably in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. She collapsed into her own mess, her carefully styled hair now matted with sweat and worse, her makeup running down her face in streaks of mascara and foundation. The woman who had tried to destroy me with chemical warfare was now destroying herself in the most public way imaginable. Daniel was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Guests were screaming and pushing back from our table. The photographer was still taking pictures, probably thinking this would make for an interesting wedding album. And through it all, I sat perfectly still, watching the consequences of Victoria's choices play out exactly as physics and chemistry demanded they must. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory or revenge. What I felt was something much colder and more final. I felt like I was watching the last gasps of a toxic relationship that had been poisoning our family for months. Victoria had finally revealed her true nature in front of everyone who mattered, and there would be no coming back from this moment. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the damage was already done. As they worked to stabilize Victoria and get her onto a stretcher, I noticed her purse had fallen to the floor during the chaos. The contents had spilled out across the marble, including that small glass vial that was now completely empty. Daniel saw it too. I watched his face change as the pieces fell into place. The vial, the timing, the fact that his mother had been perfectly fine until she started drinking from what she thought was my glass. His medical training helped him connect the dots faster than most people would have. He picked up the vial with a napkin, careful not to contaminate any fingerprints that might be on it. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment or even surprise. It was something much deeper and more profound. It was the look of a man who was finally seeing his mother clearly for the first time in his life. For the first time in his life. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and something that might have been respect. Daniel was a surgeon, trained to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, but this was different. This was his family imploding in real time, and he was being forced to choose sides in a war he hadn't even known was being fought. The ambulance doors slammed shut, taking Victoria away to face whatever consequences awaited her at the hospital. The reception hall had emptied except for close family and the catering staff, who were quietly cleaning up the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about wedding disaster in the city's social history. Daniel and I stood alone in the wreckage of our reception, still in our wedding clothes, surrounded by overturned chairs and the lingering smell of Victoria's humiliation. He was holding that empty vial like it contained the answers to every question he'd never thought to ask about his mother. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened," he said, his voice clinical and detached in that way doctors use when they're trying to maintain professional distance from personal trauma. "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told him about seeing Victoria at the bar, about the vial, about the 3 clear drops falling into my champagne. I told him about the split-second decision to switch our glasses, and why I had chosen to let her drink her own poison instead of stopping her. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, turning that vial over and over in his hands. "You could have died," he said finally. "If you had drunk whatever was in here, you could have died at our wedding reception." The reality of it hit me then, harder than it had in the moment when I was operating on pure instinct. Victoria hadn't just been trying to embarrass me or make me sick. She had been willing to risk my life to get me out of her son's world. The woman who had raised Daniel, who had kissed his scraped knees and read him bedtime stories, had been prepared to poison his bride on the most important day of his life. "I should have stopped her," I said, the guilt finally catching up with me. I should have grabbed the glass, called security, done something other than let her drink it, herself. Daniel looked at me like I had lost my mind. "You should have stopped her. Rachel, she tried to poison you. She planned this. She brought chemicals to our wedding with the intention of drugging you in front of 200 people. You saved your own life. But watching her collapse like that, seeing her so helpless and sick, I felt like I had become something I didn't recognize. A person who could watch another human being suffer and feel nothing but cold satisfaction. Daniel set the vial down on the table and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found what he was looking for, then hit call. Detective Morrison, this is Daniel Blackwell. I need to report an attempted poisoning at my wedding reception tonight. Yes, I'll hold. I watched him make that call, watched him methodically destroy any chance of a relationship with his mother, and I realized that Victoria had succeeded in one thing. She had forced Daniel to choose between his family of origin and the family he was trying to build with me. She just hadn't counted on which side he would pick. The police arrived 40 minutes later. Detective Morrison was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had probably seen every variation of family dysfunction that existed. She took our statements with the weary professionalism of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior years ago. The vial would be tested for fingerprints and chemical residue. The hospital would run blood work on Victoria to identify exactly what she had consumed. The security cameras at the venue would be reviewed to see if they had captured Victoria at the bar with the vial. It was all very methodical and official, but I could see in Detective Morrison's eyes that she had already made up her mind about what had happened. A bitter mother-in-law, a wedding she couldn't stop, a desperate attempt to sabotage the bride. She had probably worked dozens of cases just like this one. We were told that charges would likely be filed within the next few days, pending the results of the investigation. Victoria was looking at potential counts of attempted assault, reckless endangerment, and possibly attempted murder, depending on what was in that vial and how much of it she had intended me to consume. Daniel signed the complaint without hesitation. When Detective Morrison asked if he was sure he wanted to press charges against his own mother, he looked her straight in the eye and said that attempted poisoning wasn't a family dispute. It was a felony. After the police left, we sat in Daniel's car in the parking lot of the reception venue, still wearing our wedding clothes, watching the catering staff load the last of the equipment into their trucks. Our wedding cake, untouched and perfect, sat in a box in the back seat like a monument to the celebration that had never happened. "I'm sorry," I said into the silence. "I'm sorry your mother did this. I'm sorry I handled it the way I did. I'm sorry our wedding is going to be remembered for all the wrong reasons." Daniel reached over and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, the same way they had when we exchanged rings just a few hours earlier. "Don't apologize for surviving," he said quietly. "Don't apologize for protecting yourself when I wasn't able to protect you from my own family." We drove to the hospital in silence. Victoria was stable but sedated, the doctors said. Whatever she had consumed had been expelled from her system, but she would need to stay overnight for observation. The blood tests would tell them more about what exactly she had ingested. Daniel's father was waiting in the corridor outside her room, looking every one of his 72 years. Richard Blackwell had always been a quiet man who let his wife handle the social dynamics of their family. Now he was being forced to confront the fact that the woman he had been married to for 40 years was capable of attempted murder. "She's awake," he told Daniel. "She wants to see you." Daniel looked at me, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. Part of him was still the little boy who loved his mother unconditionally, but a bigger part of him was the man who had just watched her try to poison his wife. "I'll wait here," I told him. "Take all the time you need." He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, his face was set in hard lines that made him look older than his 32 years. "What did she say?" I asked. "She told me she did it to save me," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "She said you were a gold digger who was going to ruin our family's reputation. She said that once you were out of the picture, I would thank her for protecting me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Even after being caught red-handed, even after nearly poisoning herself with her own weapon, Victoria was still convinced that she was the victim in this scenario. She couldn't see past her own prejudices and entitlement to understand that she had committed a serious crime. She wants me to drop the charges," Daniel continued. "She says it was just a misunderstanding, that she never meant for anyone to get seriously hurt. She thinks if we all just forget this happened, everything can go back to normal. And what did you tell her? Daniel pulled a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. It was cream-colored stationery with Victoria's monogram at the top, covered in her distinctive handwriting. I found this in her purse when the paramedics were working on her, he said, handing it to me. Read it. I unfolded the paper and immediately recognized what I was looking at. It was a speech, written in Victoria's elegant script, titled A Mother's Apology. She had prepared remarks to deliver after I had been poisoned, explaining to the wedding guests that I had suffered some kind of breakdown due to pre-existing mental health issues and alcohol abuse. She was going to stand up in front of everyone we cared about and destroy my reputation while I was incapacitated, painting herself as the concerned mother-in-law trying to help her son's troubled wife. She had planned not just my physical assault, but my complete character assassination. This is evidence of premeditation, I said, my hands shaking as I read through her carefully crafted lies. She didn't just want to make me sick, she wanted to destroy my life. Daniel nodded grimly. I showed this to Detective Morrison. She said it proves intent and planning, which elevates the charges significantly. My mother isn't just looking at assault anymore. She's looking at attempted murder with aggravating circumstances. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations, media attention, and family drama that made our wedding reception disaster look like a minor disagreement. The story leaked to the local news, then went national when someone posted cell phone footage of Victoria collapsing at our reception. The headlines were brutal. Society matron attempts to poison daughter-in-law at wedding. Socialite faces attempted murder, charges after wedding poisoning. When mother-in-law rivalry goes too far. Victoria's friends abandoned her with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. The country club revoked her membership. The charitable organizations she had served on for decades quietly removed her from their boards. Her entire carefully constructed social identity crumbled in a matter of days. Daniel's father filed for divorce within a week of the incident. 40 years of marriage ended with a single legal document, because Richard couldn't reconcile the woman he thought he had married with the person who was capable of attempted murder. The toxicology report came back, showing that Victoria had used a combination of benzodiazepines and an emetic agent, basically a powerful sedative mixed with something designed to cause violent nausea and vomiting. In the dosage she had prepared, it wouldn't have killed me, but it would have left me unconscious and violently ill for hours. She had wanted me helpless and humiliated, completely unable to defend myself while she delivered her prepared speech about my supposed mental instability and substance abuse. It was a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even the prosecutors who had seen the worst of human nature. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after our wedding. Victoria pleaded not guilty, her lawyer arguing that she had been under extreme emotional distress and wasn't thinking clearly. They tried to paint her as a concerned mother who had made a terrible mistake in judgment, but that defense fell apart when the prosecution presented the prepared speech she had written. You can't claim temporary insanity when you've drafted a press release about your crime 3 days in advance. Daniel testified against his own mother with the same clinical precision he brought to surgery. He described finding the vial, reading her prepared remarks, and realizing that the woman who had raised him was capable of attempted murder. When Victoria's lawyer tried to suggest that this was all a family misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion, Daniel looked directly at his mother and said that attempted poisoning wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a felony committed by someone he no longer recognized as family. I watched Victoria's face during that testimony. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely shocked. She had expected Daniel to choose blood over justice, to protect her reputation over my safety. She couldn't understand that by forcing him to choose, she had lost everything. The judge denied bail, ruling that Victoria posed a continuing threat to my safety. She would remain in custody until trial. her designer suits replaced with orange jumpsuits, her perfectly manicured lifestyle reduced to institutional meals and scheduled visiting hours. 6 months later, Victoria accepted a plea bargain rather than face trial. She pled guilty to aggravated assault and reckless endangerment in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in prison and 5 years of supervised probation. As part of the plea agreement, she was required to undergo psychiatric evaluation and anger management counseling. She was also prohibited from having any contact with Daniel or me for the duration of her probation, essentially cutting her off from her son for the next 6.5 years. The day she was sentenced, Victoria looked at me across the courtroom with the same cold hatred she had shown that first day we met. Even facing prison time, even having lost her husband, her social standing, and her relationship with her son, she still believed that I was the villain in this story. But I wasn't the same person she had tried to intimidate and buy off. I was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. I was someone who had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable toxic behavior, even when it comes from family. Daniel and I left that courthouse hand in hand, finally free from the shadow that had hung over our relationship since the day we met. We had survived Victoria's worst, and we had done it together. We had learned that marriage isn't just about choosing each other in the good times. It's about choosing each other when the choice costs you everything else you thought you wanted. That night, we had the wedding dinner we never got to enjoy, just the two of us at a quiet restaurant where no one knew our story. We toasted to new beginnings, to hard-won wisdom, and to the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure instead of cracking apart. The whole experience had taught me something profound about the nature of family and loyalty. Blood relations don't automatically deserve your trust or your protection. Real family is built on respect, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. And sometimes protecting the family you've chosen means cutting ties with the family you were born into. Victoria had tried to poison more than just my champagne that night. She had tried to poison Daniel's perception of me, our guest's opinion of our marriage, and our faith in each other. But poison only works if you consume it willingly, and we had both learned to recognize the taste of toxicity, icety. Looking back now, 18 months after Victoria's sentencing, I can see how that night fundamentally rewired the architecture of our marriage. Daniel and I didn't just survive his mother's assault. We learned to build something entirely new from the wreckage she left behind. The first few months were brutal. Daniel struggled with guilt that ate at him like acid. He would wake up at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, replaying every family dinner where Victoria had made subtle digs at me while he sat there saying nothing. He tortured himself with questions that had no good answers. How long had she been planning to hurt me? What other schemes had he missed? Could he have prevented it if he had been paying closer attention? I found him one night sitting on our kitchen floor at 2 a.m., surrounded by photo albums from his childhood. He was methodically removing every picture that included his mother, creating 2 separate piles on the hardwood. The keep pile was devastatingly small. The discard pile looked like a bonfire waiting to happen. He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow. "I keep trying to find signs," he said, "some indication that she was capable of this. But all I see is the woman who made me chicken soup when I was sick and drove 4 hours to watch my high school graduation." That was the hardest part for Daniel. Victoria hadn't been a cartoon villain. She had been a complex person capable of genuine love for her son, while simultaneously harboring murderous hatred for his wife. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. I sat down on the floor next to him, gathering the scattered photographs. Some showed Victoria at Daniel's medical school graduation, beaming with pride. Others captured family vacations where she looked genuinely happy. But mixed in were more recent photos from our engagement party, and in those, I could see something different in her expression when she looked at me. Something cold and calculating that I had missed at the time. "She loved you," I told Daniel. That part was real. But she loved the version of you that belonged completely to her. When I came along, I represented a threat to that ownership, and she couldn't handle sharing you. Daniel picked up a photo from his 8th birthday party. Victoria was kneeling behind him, her arms wrapped around his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. "She looks so normal," he said. "How do you go from this to attempted murder?" I thought about my kindergarten students, how some of them could be sweet and affectionate one moment, and then throw violent tantrums when they didn't get their way. The capacity for love and the capacity for cruelty often existed in the same person, separated only by circumstances and choices. "People aren't all good or all bad," I said carefully. "Your mother did love you, but that love became possessive and toxic. When she couldn't control our relationship through manipulation, she escalated to violence. That doesn't erase the good memories, but it does mean she's not safe to have in our lives." We spent that night going through 30 years of photographs, creating a timeline of Victoria's behavior patterns. What we discovered was sobering. There were subtle signs going back years. Daniel's college girlfriend, who had mysteriously transferred schools after Victoria befriended her parents. His medical school study partner, who had stopped coming around after Victoria started inviting her to family events and filling her head with doubts about Daniel's commitment to their friendship. Victoria had a history of identifying threats to her relationship with Daniel and systematically removing them from his life. I was just the first one who had fought back instead of quietly disappearing. The revelation helped Daniel understand that what happened at our wedding wasn't an isolated incident of temporary insanity. It was the culmination of decades of controlling behavior that had finally escalated beyond psychological manipulation into physical assault. We decided that night to sell the engagement ring Daniel had inherited from his grandmother. It had been in the Blackwell family for 4 generations, but it represented a legacy we no longer wanted to carry forward. We used the money to take a 3-week honeymoon in Italy, something we had postponed because of the legal proceedings. In a small village outside Florence, sitting in a cafe that had been serving coffee for longer than our families had existed, Daniel finally started to heal. We were completely anonymous there, just another American couple on vacation. No one knew our story or looked at us with the mixture of pity and fascination we had grown accustomed to at home. One evening, as we walked along cobblestone streets that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, Daniel stopped suddenly and pulled me into an alcove between 2 ancient buildings. "I need to tell you something," he said, his hands cupping my face in the golden light of a street lamp. When I saw that vial on the floor at our reception, part of me was relieved. Not that you had been in danger, but that I finally had proof I wasn't crazy. I had been feeling like something was wrong for months, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. He explained how Victoria had been subtly undermining our relationship in ways so small that he had questioned his own perceptions. She would make comments about how tired I looked, suggesting that teaching was too stressful for someone my age. She would mention articles she had read about couples who married too quickly and later regretted it. She would bring up Daniel's ex-girlfriend in conversations, comparing her accomplishments to my supposedly limited career prospects. It was psychological warfare disguised as concern, designed to plant seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind about whether I was really the right person for him. The fact that it had been so subtle made it even more insidious. Daniel had felt the manipulation but couldn't quite identify what was happening. "I used to think I was being ungrateful," he said. "Here was my mother, trying to help me make good decisions about my future, and I was resenting her for it. But now I understand that she wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to isolate me." That conversation in Florence was a turning point. Daniel stopped apologizing for his mother's behavior and started recognizing himself as one of her victims. He began seeing a therapist who specialized in family, trauma, learning to separate his legitimate love for the woman who had raised him from his obligation to tolerate her toxic behavior. The therapy helped him understand something crucial about family loyalty. Real loyalty isn't about protecting someone from the consequences of their actions. It's about holding them accountable because you love them enough to want them to become better people. By pressing charges against Victoria, Daniel had actually demonstrated the highest form of love. He had refused to enable her destructive behavior, even though it cost him the relationship. When we returned from Italy, we found that Victoria's conviction had become something of a cautionary tale in certain social circles. Other women started reaching out to me, sharing their own stories of toxic mothers-in-law who had tried to sabotage their marriages through various means. One woman told me about a mother-in-law who had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on her past. Another described how her husband's mother had spread rumors about an affair that never happened, nearly destroying her marriage before the truth came out. A third woman revealed that her mother-in-law had been intercepting her mail and reading her private correspondence for years. The stories were all different in their details, but they shared common themes. Possessive mothers who couldn't accept that their adult children had formed primary attachments to other people. Women who used manipulation, guilt, and sometimes outright sabotage to maintain control over their sons. Families who enabled the behavior by dismissing it as harmless meddling or maternal concern. I started a support group for women dealing with toxic in-laws, meeting monthly in the community room of our local library. What began as an informal gathering of 5 or 6 women quickly grew into a movement. We had wait lists for our sessions and requests to start additional groups in neighboring communities. The women who attended came from all walks of life. Teachers, lawyers, nurses, stay-at-home mothers, executives. The only thing they had in common was the experience of being targeted by someone who was supposed to welcome them into the family, but instead saw them as a threat to be eliminated. We shared strategies for dealing with manipulation tactics, setting boundaries, and protecting our marriages from outside interference. We practiced responses to common guilt trips and passive-aggressive comments. Most importantly, we validated each other's experiences and reminded ourselves that we weren't crazy, oversensitive, or imagining things. Some of the stories made Victoria's attempted poisoning seem almost quaint by comparison. One woman's mother-in-law had tried to have her committed to a psychiatric facility by filing false reports with social services. Another had discovered that her husband's mother was slowly poisoning their dog in an attempt to frame her for animal abuse. Today, Daniel and I have been married for 3 years. We live in a house we bought together, far from the Blackwell estate and the toxic legacy it represented. We've built something entirely new from the ground up, brick by brick, choice by choice. Sometimes people ask if I regret switching those glasses that night. They wonder if I should feel guilty about letting Victoria drink her own poison instead of stopping her. But here's what I've learned about survival. When someone tries to destroy you, protecting yourself isn't cruel, it's necessary. Victoria taught me that family isn't defined by blood or tradition or how much money sits in a trust fund. Real family is built by people who choose to love, support, and protect each other. Real family doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. That little glass vial changed everything, but not in the way Victoria intended. Instead of poisoning my marriage, it purified it. Instead of driving Daniel away, it showed him who I really was under pressure. And instead of destroying my future, it gave me the strength to build exactly the life I wanted. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, I hope you'll choose yourself every time. Trust your instincts. Set your boundaries. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to drink the poison someone else has prepared for you. Drop a comment and tell me about a time you had to stand up to someone who was supposed to love you. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.